All right, I think we're ready to get going. Like to welcome everybody. This is the National Conservation Systems Cotton and Rice Insect Roundtable. We've been doing this now for several years. We actually have a title that you'll see in your program, Learning to Live with Insects, Understanding the Economics of IPM. Really what we're going to do is you have entomologists on this panel from all over the Mid-South region, and we're going to touch on some stuff in cotton. We're going to talk a little bit about corn, and we're going to finish up today talking a little bit about soybean insects as well. But I think one of the things we ought to do before we get going is let's just kind of go around and introduce ourselves to you. My name is Angus Catchot. I'm an extension entomologist at Mississippi State University.
Well, I'm Scott Stewart. I am no longer an extension entomologist at University of Tennessee. I'm in a new role right now, but I'm kind of doing double duty, but I'm here in Jackson.
I'm Ben Thrash. I'm an extension entomologist at University of Arkansas.
Lee Brown, extension entomologist at the LSU Ag Center.
Towles, extension research entomologist with LSU Ag Center.
Jeff Gore, research and extension entomologist at Mississippi State in Stoneville.
Don Cook, entomologist, Mississippi State at Stoneville.
Whitney Crow, extension entomologist, Mississippi State.
Nick Bateman, extension entomologist over at Stuttgart.
All right, well, I think that's good on introductions. I think we will go ahead and get right into it. We have about 45 minutes this morning to discuss some of these topics, and we're going to start with cotton. We got three things we're going to talk about in cotton, really probably the three things that we deal with annually every year, and we're going to start with thrips. So with thrips going into this 2021 season, I guess, Whitney, I'm going to kick it off to you right off the bat, then we'll kind of bounce it around a little bit. But at least in Mississippi and maybe some of the other Mid-South states will chime in on this, but will you tell everybody kind of what our current recommendations are for controlling thrips right now this coming year into 2021?
Yeah, of course. So in the last couple of years, we are no longer using thiamethoxam-based products for the control of thrips. However, we still are reliant on Catchot or imidacloprid. However, we're not recommending that product individually. So your options are either a Catchot seed treatment or in furrow, so Admire Pro, which would be roughly 9.2 ounces, or if you were going to use a generic imidacloprid, a 4-pound product would be roughly 10. Using that in combination with some form of acephate, whether that be an acephate seed treatment at 6.4 ounces per hundredweight, or you could utilize acephate in furrow at 3/4 of a pound to a pound. The idea is by using at planting or seed treatments that we can minimize the use of foliar applications. If we do need to use foliar applications, in the last couple of years, or even last year, Radiant was providing the best control foliarly. However, that doesn't mean you couldn't use Intrepid Edge or acephate. I will kind of toss it to Scott because in the last couple of years, we've seen a decline in efficacy with acephate foliarly. And he's been doing some stuff that he can mention that he's been working on, and maybe throwing some other things they're seeing in Tennessee before we open it across the Mid-South.
Yeah, thanks, Whitney. I'll comment, and it's been really more than the last couple of years in West Tennessee that we've seen some issues with acephate just not working as well on tobacco thrips. And so we've not seen as much advantage to putting it on the seed in combination with imidacloprid. And it's not, I don't want to overstate it. It's not that it's not providing any control, but it's clearly diminished. And we've been doing some screening of populations really throughout the Cotton Belt, or at least the Southeast. And what we're seeing is there's a variable susceptibility to these populations. Some of them are clearly resistant to acephate, some of them are not. And it's kind of interesting how it seems to be maybe spreading a little bit from outside of Tennessee, but we have some locations, you go south 200 miles to Angus's location, and acephate really looks good in his trials, and they really look poor in mine. I think the long and short of it is what we saw this year in my data was very clear. We're seeing that 1/4 pound rate of acephate is not working as well as it used to. we could kind of in run it by using a half pound of acephate. That definitely brought our control levels up. Bidrin seemed to be doing better than that quarter pound of acephate. But like you mentioned, what I've seen in my trials for the last several years is Intrepid Edge or Radiant's been the most consistent product. The rub there is it's fairly expensive, and so people don't want to use it. You know, maybe this is an academic discussion in 2 or 3 years when that new Thrive On trait from Bayer comes out. If that penetrates the marketplace, we might not be worrying about thrips anymore. But for now, I think we at least need to be aware that acephate doesn't work as well everywhere as it once did.
You know, I want to mention, kind of back up and mention another product that we get a fair amount of use with, depending on the weather. And we didn't mention it from a foliar standpoint, but we do use a lot of acephate foliar because it's cheap. Of course, there's some baggage there with flaring spider mites and such, but typically something that we go to, even though it is a little more costly, not as much as Radiant, you know, or Intrepid Edge. But when we get in a rainy period, of course, acephate, you know, and rain don't get along very well. So a lot of times we'll switch to Bidrin. So I did want to mention that. And Steve, you may want to mention, I think in Louisiana, you and Tyler, y'all actually use a lot more Radiant and Intrepid Edge right out of the gate because of spider mites. Am I thinking right when I say that?
Yeah, I mean, guys have, well, with the cost of cotton, guys have kind of switched to some of the cheaper alternatives, but we do have guys that are almost exclusively use nothing but Radiant just because they've been burned by spider mites in the past. So, but yeah, we've got a fair amount that still use acephate, or they've moved to Bidrin because it's kind of on the flaring spectrum. It's not as high as acephate, but it's not as low as Radiant. So.
And I would comment in my trials, Bidrin seems to be holding up better than acephate, which is a little surprising because they're both OPs. But I think that's probably a better option to kind of overcome this acephate resistance. Again, where it occurs, it's not an issue everywhere. One thing that was pretty consistent in all our trials, we did a regional test this year. We did have a pyrethroid in the mix. One thing we've kind of known for a while, don't do that. You cannot kill a thrips with a pyrethroid insecticide. In fact, it might make them a little bit worse.
Why don't we touch just before, I mean, I don't want to just keep beating thrips the whole time, but you mentioned the Thrive On, which a lot of people call the plant bug, cotton, and so forth. But I think we ought to say a little bit more about what we've actually seen with that from a thrips control standpoint. And when this stuff finally gets completely deregulated, you know, what we can expect, because people are already starting to ask more questions about it as it gets closer to market. So what has been everybody's really experience over about the last, 5-7 years with Thrive On, looking at it from a thrips control standpoint? In my opinion, what I've seen is it'll be something you do not spray foliar for thrips, and just curious if everybody else has seen the same.
In
Yeah,
Arkansas,
before we
definitely
get-
we have. It's looked really good for us in Arkansas. Like you're not going to have to spray it if it holds up across, you know, across everybody, all the wide acreage.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. It's looked impervious to thrips. My understanding is when they market this Thrive On or Ligas cotton plant bug cotton, it's going to come with the seed treatment of imidacloprid anyhow. I'm not even sure that's necessary. Maybe there's benefits outside of thrips control, but you know, it's looked pretty impervious in, I think, my trials, and as far as I can tell, everybody else's trials as well.
Jeff, you was going to say something about Thrive On?
Well, no, I was going to say before we get too deep into Thrive On, I was just going to mention on the acephate thing, you know, we talked a lot about Tennessee, but we actually saw less than acceptable control in Stoneville last year too with acephate. So don't think it's just a Tennessee problem. It's starting to show up in other places as well.
So let me ask you this, and I wanted to, either you or Scott, where the resistance is starting to pop up, is it exclusive to the foliar applications? Are you not getting any benefit from the systemic, either in-furrow spray or seed treatment as well?
Well, I'll comment that it's somewhere in between. It's definitely providing some benefit, but just comparing our observations in Tennessee, the in-furrows and the seed treatments have not held up all well at all for the last 4 or 5 years. And to Jeff's point, yes, Jeff's populations in Stoneville tested less than susceptible. Probably the most resistant population I tested was one of Dr. Lorenz's populations from Marianna, Arkansas. So it seems like it's kind of creeping a little bit to the south over time. Keep it in mind. But again, I also mentioned, and I've seen a lot of Angus's data, asphate's holding up very well in that Starkville area. And we might be getting some benefit that we're just not spraying asphate on much else at that time of year except cotton. So maybe that's one of the reasons we're able to kind of get by in some places.
All right,
Yeah,
so
and you mentioned we have that resistance in Marianna that was pretty high, and then you go south to our location in Tiller, and there's not a whole lot of resistance down there.
All
just
right. One
go
thing
ahead.
wanted to throw out, we're talking about resistance, we're talking about efficacy. We might want to mention a little bit of why are we even dealing with thrips, because you get further south in the cotton belt, you don't always see yield losses from thrips, but we almost always see delayed maturity, which has its own consequences. Now, Scott and some folks in the further north part can show yield losses every year when they have infestations. So just a little background on why we even deal with them.
Yeah, those delayed maturity things might not be a direct yield loss from thrips, but anything in our region where plant bugs are so bad that causes you another 7 to 10 days of a growing season because maturity delayed might be another plant bug or even 2 applications. So there's always these indirect. Just to kind of wrap up thrips, I'll just kind of say going forward, even though we recognize we're starting to see a few issues pop up with acephate, for us, our recommendation will be some kind of imidacloprid, like Whitney said, base seed treatment, whether on seed or sprayed in furrow with acephate, and hopefully we can run this thing out till we get this Thrive On technology in there. But with that, I think we probably ought to move to plant bugs. This is, one of our most consistent economic pests across the whole Mid-South. Ben, you've done a tremendous amount of work for our whole Mid-South working group, where you've looked at all of the data over about the last 10 years of everything that we're all doing. You've done a really good job pulling all that data together. I guess in your opinion, going into this year, what's standing out as far as the treatments that we're all pretty uniformly recommending and routinely using across the South right now to control plant bugs?
Well, the most consistent performer seems to be Transform. Looking at it, over the past 7 or 8 years, Transform's just consistently good. There's not just a whole lot of variability from year to year. Looking at our data now, acephate and Bidrin are consistently some of our top performers, and we frequently add bifenthrin in there with our acephate and Bidrin shots, and looking at our data, some places seem to get a lot more benefit adding that bifenthrin in there as far as for plant bug control than some other places. I think when I looked at our data in Arkansas, it was like close to 20% boost in control adding bifenthrin in with acephate. Whereas, we looked at Mississippi, looked at y'all's data, it was only like a couple, 3% additional efficacy you were getting from adding bifenthrin in with acephate. But we had talked about what are some of the benefits of just keeping that bifenthrin in there, instead of just running acephate. If I'm not getting anything out of it, why add it in there? Well, we had talked about, you are still getting something out of it. You're possibly killing some small worms out there and stuff like that. Bifenthrin does have a little does have a little activity on some spider mites and stuff in the right situation. So I wouldn't just totally throw out bifenthrin adding it to our acephate or bidrin. You know, you're still getting a little benefit there on some other things.
It'll add.
Diamond, I didn't mention diamond. You know, diamond is something that we've been recommending for years, and really looking at our data set, what it seems to do. You know, we've always known it's helped control plant bugs in some real difficult situations. But if you look at it, when we use it in combination, really what it seems to do is extend our residual for a bunch of our insecticides. It doesn't have a lot of knockdown in an insect growth regulator, but it really extends the residual control of a lot of insecticides.
I think one of the important things
we really
to
learned
remember
about that product is, and I don't know if saying extending the residuals the right word. It's just that it takes diamond a week to 10 days before we really start seeing a big impact from it. So it does effectively increase the residual.
Yeah.
It's just that diamond kicking in, and basically the way we've positioned it is spraying it early to basically break that reproductive cycle.
Right.
You know, one of the things I've noticed, if you look at our cotton losses over, say, the last 5 to 7 years, and I'm not in any way diminishing plant bugs being our number one economic pest in cotton in the Mid-South, because they absolutely are. But I will tell you, over the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years, even though the products we have available to us are somewhat limited as far as providing really good control, as Ben has already said, against plant bugs, I think now, I guess in the last few years, I don't have that fear of plant bugs where I just felt like we didn't have a good opportunity to keep them under control during the season as I used to. And I think there's a lot of reasons. We've worked on a whole bunch of stuff when it comes to plant bugs as a group, but I think, getting to the whole IPM thing, all we're talking about right now is foliars, but one of the things that, or a set of things that we've been recommending for years that have begun to be adopted really across a wide scale, I think is having a landscape effect. Planting early when you can, blocking your corn away from cotton, early season varieties. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there. The use of diamond early when you get into these intervals of extreme heavy pressure where they may occur, tightening our intervals to 5 to 6 days instead of trying to stretch it out to 10 and letting that cycle start over. But I think just really the combination of all of these things that we've really been recommending as a group overall, I think has driven our total number of apps down the last few years. At least it appears to be that from my standpoint.
I agree, Angus. It seems like we have tools to manage the problem. Insecticide wise, we don't have a lot of selections, but we have 3 or 4 good selections that you can use in combination, and tank mixes or alternating. And, you just kind of got to pick your poison literally by what's in the field and what else you might be targeting. But we're doing a pretty good job of managing our plant bugs right now. I guess this would be a good time to mention that Thrive On technology is going to help us a little bit. It's certainly not going to be, don't worry about plant bugs anymore kind of technology, but it's going to be another tool to help us manage those plant bugs when that product becomes introduced into the market.
And something, I've talked to guys about, mentioned on Angus's landscape, and this kind of plays into the Thrive On thing, is that, with corn, guys are booking corn at over $6 a bushel now. We're losing a lot of cotton acres to corn, and what cotton's out there is going to be surrounded by corn wall to wall. And so guys are going to have to really start, thinking about, where can I place this in relation to my neighbor, because it's going to just be an onslaught of plant bugs if they're surrounded by corn on 4 sides. So that's something I've tried to communicate to our guys here, because, we have our cotton acreage is the smallest in the Mid-South, and it looks like it's going to continue to go down just because corn is going to be overwhelming in the landscape. So I think that's going to be important too. Just hitting back on Angus's point.
Yeah, and it does seem no matter how hard we've tried or all the things we previously mentioned that's helped, one of the things that we have never been real successful in controlling plant bugs is that immediate edge effect next to corn. And that's why it is so important, I guess, to if you can, and I understand you just can't always do that, is to block your corn the best you can away from cotton. So, I'm gonna mention one more thing about plant bugs. That building a little bit on what Scott just said, we do have three or really about three good top products that we recommend now, and we seem to be getting by pretty good by recommending this multi-tactical true IPM approach to plant bug control. But with all the government regulation coming down now, if we ever lost one of those two or three that are currently available, we could quickly go right back to where we were 5-7 years ago. It's important all of those materials are available so we can mix it up some and alternate modes of action or approach. And I think we forget about that sometime, but it would be critical that we at least can maintain what we got. Any other comments on plant bugs before we move into worms? All right, let's switch gears then. Let's talk a little bit about worms. I think it's pretty widely accepted now that we see a lot more worms. I'm not going to say full-blown resistance, no control with some of the 2-gene cotton, such as Bogard 2. But we do know at times now we see a lot less than desirable control, in the 2-gene cottons. As a result of that, a lot of us have modified or changed our thresholds to address it. Jeff, I'm going to kind of push it to you a little bit to tell everybody right now, what are we recommending from a control standpoint, a threshold standpoint to control worms in cotton, and what do we need to be thinking about for this upcoming season?
Yeah, before I get into thresholds, I just wanted to first mention, you talked about from a plant bug standpoint that the number of sprays have gone down. And they have, if you look at the way we track that. But a lot of growers and consultants haven't realized that benefit that we've seen, because we've essentially replaced 2 or 3 plant bug sprays with 2 or 3 bollworm sprays with $20 diamides. And so right now the growers aren't recognizing that overall decline in plant bug control because it's being masked because we're spending so much on worms. And as Angus mentioned, we are, dealing with resistance to the 2-gene products, things like Bogard 2, the cryoproteins. And so from a management standpoint, we're spraying a lot more, and we do have had to adjust our thresholds a little bit. Historically, on any BT cotton, we've always recommended not spraying on worms, but not spraying on eggs, but we've had to adjust that in the last couple of years. So now on any of the 2-gene products, our thresholds are 20% of plants with at least 1 egg on it. So if you look at 100 plants, 20 of those have at least 1 egg on them, that would trigger a spray. It's not, if you find 5 eggs on 4 plants, you end up with 20 eggs, but that's not 20%. It's 20% of plants infested with eggs. And then on the 3-gene, things like Bogard 3, Wide Strike 3, and Twin Link Plus, we're not recommending an egg threshold yet. Certainly in the near future, things could change quickly, and we could go to an egg threshold if we start seeing resistance to that VIT protein. But right now, the 3-gene stuff's holding up well. So we're sticking with our damage threshold of 6% damage, or mine just went blank, 4. I think it's 4 live larvae greater than 1/8 of an inch per 100 plants. So that's where we stand in terms of when to spray.
So as far as, so you told us, when to spray based on our thresholds. And you hit on a little bit what to spray. Let's talk a little bit now. Anybody want to jump in about that, what to spray? Maybe some of your experiences with really the products that we're using for worm control and how it could potentially vary from region to region. I think you've already mentioned, particularly in Mississippi, we're pretty much using the diamides when we're truly going after worms that are above threshold. What is everybody else's go-to, or is there anything else in your region that you're recommended?
Well, I'll chime in, and we're the same way, Angus. We're relying on Prevathon or Besiege specifically for the brunt of it. There's a few circumstances, very late in the season when you don't need the residual control that you might be able to get by with a orthene bifenthrin, for example. And what my data is showing in Tennessee is that alternative works pretty well for about 5 or 6 days, and then you start seeing the difference. So if you're in that situation where you only need 5 or 6 days, I think it's a fit. When this kind of phenomenon first started happening, though, I got burned a couple of times by recommending the orthene and the bifenthrin because people had to go back and respray. So, one of the challenges is you really don't know what the future holds for you when you make that application, but a lot of times it's going to be a second spray, and that's just not cost effective. You're money ahead just to start off with a Prevathon or a Besiege and get that extra residual control. For us, it's not been quite as problematic. The way our worms move in is typically late enough. We can get by with that one spray. You go further south where the pressure's heavier, where the season's longer, that's where you start talking about 2 applications or more, and that gets pretty hard on the pocketbook.
I think too, one of the things we are frequently in Mississippi in a 2-spray environment and even an occasional 3. But a lot of times those, either the 2 or certainly the 3, we're really hitting cutout pretty hard at that point. Whitney, I know you pulled together a lot of real recent plant bug data that Dr. Darren Dodge generated before he left to be department head, where he looked at some of our most current varieties that we're growing, 1646 being one, and a few other common ones, just about the way the fruit's distributed across the plant and so forth. But one of the questions that we've tried to address a lot the last 2 years, trying to save a grower some money, really, instead of dropping that $20 diamide really late in the season, is really just kind of go back to some of just fundamental agronomics of cotton. What is that fruit bringing to the table at that point in the season as far as making it an economic benefit from making that real late worm application to maybe some 3rd position bowls, or maybe just the top 3 to 4 nodes in the top of the plant from some of the data that you've put together? What did you see?
So we know from some of the stuff Darren put together that obviously the 1st and 2nd positions are the most critical as far as contributing to yield, and the bottom and the middle. So once we start getting later in the season and the top of the plant or the upper portions, they're contributing lesser to the overall amount of yield. But not only that, I think it's just taking a step back and looking at where our damage is and how much is actually occurring. And so we, using a couple of different factors, we estimated that roughly 7 to 9 bowls per 10 row of feet per acre is what's equating to about 40 pounds of loss to cover the cost of a diamide application. So I think once you get later in the season, we need to be considerate of where this damage is occurring. So 3rd position bowls are going to be contributing less than other positions, and the upper portion of the plant is going to be contributing less than the bottom and the middle of the plant. So I think it's just taking into consideration the number of damaged bowls as well as the location of that damage is occurring, to just consider if there's enough happening to warrant the cost of a diamide application, or if you would be better off using something like acephate plus bifenthrin, depending on the amount of residual that you may need.
Yeah, I know I recommended the last 2 years a lot of just pyrethroid acephate very late in the year, and every one of them, all the people that did that came back and seemed to be extremely pleased with that application at that point in the season. That top part of the plant, just like you said, just doesn't contribute much to what goes into the basket. And a lot of times you're actually throwing good money after bad with a really expensive shot there. I'm going to back up one more time because this worm thing is pretty important. One of the so two things here. Some pushback I always get about the conversation we just had about, yeah, okay, you say this don't contribute to yield, but if I got 10% live worms in the top two nodes of the plant, they're going to go down that plant, hit them big money bowls. Y'all, I just haven't seen that in Bollgard 2 cotton. Even though they're resistant, we know that we have resistance. I do not see those worms going down the plant like in non-BT cotton, just knocking off fruit and form after fruit and form after fruit and form that late in the season. It just really don't happen very often. I'm not saying they can't get one or two, but is that some of your experiences as well?
Yeah, one of the things that we're missing now that I was just thinking about is number one is we don't have that good $6 to $8 worm product that may not give you a long residual, but it gives you good knockdown, and it's perfect thing in those situations. But the thing I kind of thought about as Whitney was talking, and as you talked about that, Angus, is remember, I guess it's 15, 20 years ago, we used to use Curacron for that last shot. And that was something that could clean up the last little bit of worms we had in the field, clean up plant bugs, clean up spider mites. And that's the thing that we're really missing in cotton now is that one product that may not be great for any one pest, but it was really good at cleaning up low numbers of a whole complex of a bunch of different pests. And so I think that's kind of now where that acephate pyrethroid that you're talking about fits in late. It'd be nice to have that one product like Curacron. Wasn't super expensive, but you could kind of finish off the crop with that one spray.
Yeah, and to reinforce your point, Angus, I think, a lot of times we say resistance. It's a lot of times different levels of resistance. It's not like Bollgard 2 is doing nothing. It's just not doing well enough that we can just walk away from it and assume we're not going to have to spray. Last year in my trials, the pressure was light enough and the bollworms were late enough that my Bollgard 2 did more than enough. Even in my non-BT cotton, the worms were late enough and the pressure light enough that I saw a yield response from spraying, but it didn't matter what I sprayed because I think, it was just late enough in the season. Just that week of protection is probably all I really needed.
And I'll kind of, you're right. And I'll kind of finish it with this as an example. And I think your comment about the thrips resistance with acephate and how it pops up here and there in different places is really a good example that fits worms as well. I got sites in different places in the Delta, and, scattered around like we all do. And you go to one site 20 miles, you get a super big egg lay and Bollgard 2, you get very little damage. And then you go 10, 15 miles up the road, you get the same egg lay. And for whatever reason you get extreme damage. And one of my locations, last year, sort of in the north central Delta, we had some really heavy egg lays, and I had some large blocks of unsprayed Bollgard 2 right next to unsprayed Bollgard 3. And I probably approached 35, 40% boll damage in my Bollgard 2 and had almost really zero in my Bollgard 3. And 20 miles down the road with not quite as heavy of egg lay, but certainly a heavy enough egg lay to cause extensive damage, I got hardly anything. And that's what complicates these situations. Geography complicates it tremendously for whatever reason. And it could have a lot to do with where those worms are coming from. And that kind of moves us into our next topic. We all know corn is a huge driver.
Hey, Angus?
Yeah.
Before we get off, the one thing I want to mention, you talking about real late in the season. Sometimes we forget that when those bowls get to be a certain age, the worms can't get into it.
Yeah. Yep. But I do think we all completely agree that corn's driving our worm problem in cotton. In some of those geographic differences that we're seeing as far as the level of control. A lot of it may have to do with what kind of corn they come out of. Maybe they've been pre-selected coming through, say, double pro, triple pro, whatever corn, 2-gene corn. Maybe they have more tolerance in that particular geography. So when they do come out and find their way to cotton, well, maybe we see more damage there. It makes perfect sense. So, Tyler, I'm going to kind of kick it to you now. You did your whole PhD looking at this kind of stuff, what emerges and so forth. Let you make some comments about corn and, possibly how that may affect cotton and really the damage we may even see in the corn itself.
Yeah, so pretty much it's important to understand that, early season hosts such as clovers, when all that stuff tends to dry down before worms move into cotton, we see majority, if not all, of those naturally occurring populations go through corn. And corn plays a big role in how we see BT resistance form in cotton, because we're seeing a lot of pre-selection. A lot of our cotton hybrids share a lot of cryoproteins with this cotton. If they're not closely related, they're the same cryoprotein altogether. So these worms will pretty much survive in this corn, and that coupled with probably less than perfect refuge compliance is kind of driving these worms to or these adult moths to become resistant to these BT proteins. And then once they leave the corn, they go straight to the cotton and they start laying eggs. And then you've got larvae in your field that have been pre-selected to these BT proteins in a previous crop. What's really important to remember when it comes to corn is that when we add a cryoprotein to corn, it's not that we're trying to protect from bollworm per se, it's that we're trying to protect from corn borers. And corn borers are controlled very well with cryoproteins. And another thing that is very important to keep in mind is that new VIP protein is coming out in corn, and Don Cook has compiled me a data set over the past 5 or 6 years, looking at 50 trials where we just measured corn yield from bollworm infestation between non-BT, 2-gene, and 3-gene corn. And what we're seeing is you're not seeing any kind of yield bump from a non-BT hybrid versus a 3-gene hybrid. So essentially what that means is it doesn't matter if you've got those 3 genes or not, you're not seeing any kind of positive return for buying that when it comes to bollworm control. So if we could theoretically, best shot of holding on to these 3 genes in cotton would to be plant corn that does not have that VIP protein in it.
Well, part of what drives this is corn growers pick a hybrid based on yield. And I mean, if it's got the latest BT technology, it's yielding 10 bushels more than whatever else, that's what they're going to plant. And that's the reality of it. But like Tyler said, we've rarely seen a situation where we see a yield impact from bollworm infestations in the year. I mean, rarely compared to what it takes to de-shield in non-BT, we don't even get close to that as far as the amount of damage.
So Don, what did your data show? I mean, I know that people don't like to look at a big earworm in the end of an ear of corn, even though we know it's generally not economic. But what's the kernel count that it takes to even measure yield as far as damaged kernels per ear?
It's approximately 50 kernels per ear is what it takes to reduce yield. And looking at, and this is average over about 10,000 ears. In the non-BT, we typically see 8 to 12.
Yeah. It's hard to look at, but I think the data is pretty clear. Not even really just from the Mid-South. I think the Northeast group has conducted very similar research, came with the exact same result. So that's
one thing that I saw a lot of this year, which I mean, I've been working with this for a few years now, but I tend to see more and more and more worms in each ear, which, typically they cannibalize to where we just have 1 per ear. But it was not uncommon for me this year to look through 2 gene corn hybrids and non-BT for that matter and see 2 or 3 large larvae. And I mean, we're still really not even getting close to that 50 kernel damage.
You know, in Arkansas, we usually see about just talking about how corn kind of affects our corn earworm population. We have a big worm flight around the 4th of July typically. And the past couple of years, our corn crop our planting dates have been drug out over a pretty good amount of time. And so typically we see that 4th of July worm flight come in and it'll go to soybeans and cotton. But it seems like over the past couple of years, because we've had a lot of late planted corn, that a lot of our moths have been just cycling out of corn and going back into really late planted corn, keeping them out of the soybeans a lot of times.
We've seen the same thing here. Yeah, they'll definitely go back to corn if there's some late corn next to it. The other thing is, even though we have the resistance, there is some delay effect on the development of those bollworms. So we're seeing our moth flight kind of kicked back about, a week or so compared to what we saw 7, 8, 9 years ago. So I guess it's bringing us that. But I'm on board with what you said, Tyler. I'm still promoting folks trying to avoid planting the corn that has the VIP technology in there. I don't think there's much economic benefit in corn and a huge risk to our cotton crop if we develop resistance in those corn earworms.
This may be a tad academic, but what I've noticed for the last several years, where we plant 2-gene corn, and these are in trials, and as these resistance levels have increased, I see more damage there than I do in the non-BT in certain circumstances.
So to kind of just really summarize bollworms in general, whether it be corn or cotton, based on all the comments that were said, I think everybody pretty much agrees that corn drives our worm problems in cotton. We've already seen probably instances that we could probably blame corn for the problems we're currently seeing in cotton with the 2 genes. And as a group, we're pretty concerned about the 3 genes, the VIP corns, possibly putting a tremendous amount of selection pressure in corn, leaving corn pre-selected, going to cotton, maybe diminishing the long-term future of our Bogard 3, White Strike 3, Twin League Pluses. So it's something that we're all concerned about because we've already said as a group, from a foliar standpoint in cotton, we don't have a lot of options. We're pretty much using the diamides. So that's something, when everybody hears us kind of downplaying the importance of VIP corn, we're not saying it's not important, but in our system where we have cotton, it's a concern for us. So I'm gonna stay on corn just real briefly. Don, I'm gonna ask you something we didn't talk about earlier, but let's just briefly talk about just seed treatments in corn. All your corn is going to have a seed treatment on it now. It'd be almost impossible to find some without it. But let's make a few comments about seed treatments in corn.
Yeah, I'm gonna make this real quick. We don't worry too much about soil insects anymore because virtually all of the seed comes treated. I can remember the time when that didn't happen and see 1 or 2 or 10 or 12 train wrecks a year. The value is there just from, not having to deal with a situation where you find, where we see some of them every now and then where you got a 50 bushel difference. What value is it bringing? Based on our trials, anywhere from 1 to 2 bushels to 100, depends on the situation.
Yeah.
And the problem is you can't predict when that's going to happen.
Yeah, and my only comment is I don't think growers really probably have to think too much about it now and probably shouldn't worry about it. I think there's some special circumstances where you're doing something different, like you have a cover crop you're terminating late, or maybe you're taking a field that's been sitting fallow or pasture or something and converting it, where you probably need to put a little extra thought into what you're going to do, either higher seed treatment rates or, adding something in furrow. But for the most part, we're pretty well covered, and the products are out there are definitely needed and doing a good job.
All right, so at this point, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and we're gonna switch gears and probably for the next 5-10 minutes, talk a little bit about stink bugs. So at this point, what I'm going to do is, Sebe, I'm gonna kick it over to you now, and give us sort of just a rundown on the Red Bandit situation that we saw in 2000 and this 2020, this past season. I know Louisiana is always sort of the epicenter of that. Then we're going to touch a little bit. I'm going to get Scott to talk a little bit about brown marmorates. Those things are really picking up. Pretty common for us to find them now in Mississippi. But first, let's hit on Red Bandit stink bugs.
Yeah, so 20 for us down here, and I guess the south part of the further south part of the Mid-South, we had stink bug issues are pretty heavy for a lot of our guys, especially the further south you go, because we do a lot of sugarcane, soybean rotation. So guys plant beans to control, grasses, things like that. So that's a really, it's a big industry, especially south of I-10. And those guys typically plant very early, February, March, and then a lot of times they fight red bandits from the word go. So they're kind of my sentinel guys that see it, and they fought red bandits very hard this year. So now, granted, it doesn't freeze down that way very often. So I mean, you got to take it with a grain of salt. The further north you get, you guys, especially Scott, is probably going to, y'all's instances of red bandits are going to be a whole lot less than ours. But we had some guys I talked to sprayed 7-8 times for red bandits this past year, and so I think I've already gotten questions about our winter. I mean, we've been cold, where we are. I'm in Alexandria, so I'm in the kind of the middle part of the state. Our coldest we've been, I think, is 26, but we were only 26 for about 3 hours. So that's not enough. And it's not the super cooling point, according to Dr. Jeff Davis's work on campus, is -4 degrees Fahrenheit. So, I mean, we're not going to get that cold. So instead of getting super cold temperatures, we need duration. So, and we haven't had the duration, at least far enough south for us, to where we make any kind of significant dent in stink bugs, because that next morning we had, from that 26-degree temperature, we went out and looked at some alternative host plants, and there we easily found 4 adult red bandits out after a 26-degree night. So unless we've got some really frigid temperatures coming that I'm not seeing in extended forecasts, I think our winter kill is kind of out the door for at least some of them for us this far south.
I don't think we've had that cold a winter either.
Yeah, I agree. I still think, based on all the ditch bank surveys we do in April, I do believe that they're still a good predictor of what we might see. One of the questions we did get a lot this year is, well, they never really did develop like y'all thought they were. Well, that's true and false, I guess, at the same time. South of Highway 82, we had some 3-4 sprays. What we didn't see is the level of seed damage across the board that we saw in 2017. But a lot of that, if you think about it, we had one of the driest falls that we've ever had. And of course, environment is huge in combination with red bandits. But I do agree with Don. I don't think we've had the winter yet. We still got a lot of time left. But so far, I think we've set up ourselves to really potentially see red bandits next year, depending on what happens from this point forward. So, Scott, tell me about this brown marmorated. We're starting to find them more and more in Mississippi now, and I think they're probably more common than what we're actually being reported, even though they're being reported a lot more. But I just don't think people are recognizing them as something odd. So we have a picture up on the screen. Tell us a little bit about that. You're the authority on these things now in Tennessee.
Well, that's far from the truth, but I probably got more than in my geography than anybody else. And these things are an invasive that came in, and Pennsylvania, Delaware, that area, and they've been a real nuisance on the apple crops and things like that. Very devastating pest, and they're just migrating to the south and to the west, and they're very common in middle and east Tennessee, and starting to get pretty common in west Tennessee. We have quite a few here on the station in Jackson. They're not a very discriminate stink bug, but most stink bugs aren't. They'll feed on just about anything: cotton, corn, soybean. The adult, as you see on the left there, looks a lot like a brown stink bug, but it's not. One of the things you're looking for is those kind of striped antennae, the light and dark colored antennae. The other thing is, you'll notice around the edge of the abdomen, kind of that checkered. You'll see that on a brown stink bug, but it's not nearly as pronounced. A brown stink bug is just going to have a uniform tan color antennae. Now, the immatures, I think, are pretty easy to pick out, at least the mid stages and the later stages, because they have those striped antennae and very often those striped legs. It's an interesting behavior. They're much more active than our other stink bugs. If you catch a bunch of these in the sweep net, particularly the adults, you almost have a hard time catching them because they'll drop when they see you, but then they'll run around from you. I guess it's kind of good news, bad news. The bad news is they're picking up and they're spreading, particularly around our urban areas. It does like to overwinter in structures and in vehicles and things like that, and that's probably how it's getting transported around. That's the bad news. They feed on about everything. The good news is it's kind of just another stink bug in a way. It's not particularly difficult to manage with insecticides. They're relatively easy to kill, more like a green stink bug. So they're pretty manageable. What I've been telling folks is it's probably just going to make our stink bug problem a little bit more consistent and a little bit worse. One other thing to keep in mind with this critter is it is definitely edge oriented. It really likes to come out of tree lines. Like some of the invasive trees that we have, like tree of heaven, but there's some other ones. It's from Asia. The tree of heaven's from Asia, so I guess there's a relationship there. I don't want to freak anybody about. I don't want to freak people out about it, but we are seeing it more and more, and it just keeps increasing over time.
Yeah. So that's one thing. All you may be tuning in on this. If you're seeing this odd stink bug in soybeans or congregating in your house like they do or anywhere else, those white antennal bands, every time I call Scott, he says they got white bands. And I'm like, yep. And I'll send him a picture. That's it. So it's just something to kind of help y'all if you're seeing a stink bug you haven't been used to. We only have just a couple minutes left, but what I want to do quickly is let's just quickly talk about worms in general in soybeans before we end this. Nick, I'm going to throw this over to you. Just give us a little an update, brief update on just really the worm situation, in soybeans, whether it be bollworm, loopers, or even green clover worms for that matter.
Yeah, so from like a bollworm standpoint, particularly in Arkansas, we're going to see at least 2 to 3 generations, it seems like, come through soybeans. It's like we get rolling populations, and it's pretty regular that we get a couple egg lays within the same crop there. And a lot of times we're recommending diamides, or if the threshold's low enough, recommending something like heligen so that we can take care of that second egg lay there. As far as green clover worm, velvet beans, it seems like across the mid-south there's been a pretty good uptick in them over the past couple of years, actually having to make some applications to cover them. And as far as loopers go, for us in Arkansas, we got a pretty good flight this year. It was just short-lived. We had the virus come in and knock them out pretty quick. With that, I guess I'll turn it over, see what everyone else's opinions are on everything.
I'll mention green clover worms. That's something we never talk about. We talk about them just from the standpoint of we have them every year. It's pretty rare for Mississippi. I've been working here, at Mississippi State for 17 years, and I could really count on both hands the number of green clover worm exclusively targeted insecticide applications that we've had to make until this year. For whatever reason, we had a big outbreak of green clover worms this year, and we had a number of targeted sprays. I guess the good news is they're extremely easy to control. You just got to be careful going after them with something that's going to take out beneficials and blow up something that's harder to control, such as loopers or even bollworms. But it just does go to show that every year is different.
We had the same with velvet bean this year. We were catching 300 velvet beans in 5 sweeps. So, I mean, it's just ridiculous numbers.
That's what I was going to mention too, Steve, is we had a bunch of velvet bean caterpillars this year, as well as green clover worms.
Yeah.
And we did here, being on the northern end, we don't see velvet beans very often. Last couple of years we've seen them. We always seen green clover worms. It's debatable whether loopers are even going to get here for us, and they do about every other year it seems like. But green clover worms are always around. We spray a few fields every year. Like Angus last year was the big year where we sprayed a lot. One thing about them is they do tend to come in right around R2, R3, R4. They're a little bit early. They seem to like that stage of beans, so they'll set you up a little bit sometimes if you have to spray them, because a lot of times you'll just use a pyrethroid because they're easy to control, and you might make yourself a looper problem down the road when you do that.
Talking bollworm or corn earworm, we did this little exercise this year. We had a field that had some in it. We put some trials out, efficacy trials, but in the process, we manipulated the populations with those treatments. We went in sample over 2 weeks. The most we had was 14 for 25 sweeps. We went in at the end of the year, and counted damaged pods. We had 10% was the highest we had. We saw no yield reductions in beans with 10% damaged pods at harvest. And if I'm remembering my figures correctly.
All right, so at this point, we have been going almost an hour. I have posted the QR code for those of you needing CEUs for the Certified Crop Advisor. That is on the screen now. If you're interested in getting these CEUs, this is the point. While it's up there, take your camera, scan the QR code. I'm assuming if you are a CCA, you're familiar with this process. For some reason, if in fact you don't have a QR code, I'm sure when you watch this that they'll have a record of the people that attend, and you can possibly contact the National or the Conservation Systems Cotton and Rice Conference if you're not able to scan the QR code, and somehow they can get you a hard sign-up sheet to get you credit. So again, thank everybody for tuning in. We appreciate everybody and look forward to the time that we can get back to our normal face-to-face meetings. So hope you enjoyed this session. And with that, we will conclude. Thank you all.